I'm ready to slash and burn.
No quarter. I am going to be uncomfortable and all over you from start to finish.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Outside of the Box. And today, as you know, kind of my series of wrapping up the season and everything, I decided to have Mike Jeffries on, who was the match steward for this season, and obviously longtime builder and everything else like that. So welcome to the show, Mike.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this one for a while since we talked about it briefly during filming and then everything got crazy for a bit.
Yes, exactly. I talked to you during one of the most stressful times of anything. So yeah, happy to be able to do it. Now, since this is the first time on the show, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of fans know you, know your background, but for anybody that doesn't, I kind of want to go into that because I believe you've been building since about 2004. And you know, a lot of fans probably remember the time with Bombshell, which to me is one of like the greatest stories in BattleBots of all time. But if you can just briefly like catch us up on the background of your building prior to this role.
Sure, I'll go through kind of the big dates. So back in the Comedy Central era, I actually was out at Treasure Island, watched seasons 4 and 5 in person for a bit. So that's all the way back in 2002. Then started getting into building my own robots and met up with another builder who was nearby, Greg Gibson from Yeti. So started building up a friendship with Greg, and along comes 2004, and I joined his team for the Southwest Division Championships Steel Conflict events down in Southern California. So myself and Greg load up in his GMC Jimmy and drive from Northern California to Southern California with all of his robots, all of James Arlick's robots, all of Inertia Labs robots, and just road trip down I-5 for a weekend event in, I think it was Pomona, where it was myself, Greg, James, and then this dude, Jason Bardis, that split a hotel room. So April 2004 was kind of the first event as part of a team. Later that year, I took a little 1-pounder down to an event and passed safety, and then it got knocked off my pit table overnight, and something in the motor controller died. So really great start to the robot combat career. Took a little while to build the next bot. 2006, go to Robo Games with an ant weight and a 60-pounder, and finally get my first win with a 60. That Greg actually welded the chassis for that bot. Then a bunch of fights throughout the next couple of years. 2009, I took a 12-pounder, entered it as a 15 at the 2009 BattleBots event, and somehow came out fourth with the little 2-wheel drive wedge bot. And yeah, it was destroyed by the end of it, but hey, fourth place isn't bad. Then regularly fighting from 2011 to 2018, with the big ones being BattleBots in 2016 and 2018 with Bombshell. Following 2018, I actually stepped away from the sport for a while. So I was diagnosed with a condition called Bell's palsy, and essentially this half of my face shut off for a couple of months. That was not a fun experience, but I think in the long run, it's actually made for some really positive changes. So took some time away from the sport, eventually returned in 2021 at Dragon Con, and then started getting really ramped up in my involvement with BattleBots and some of the teams before finally becoming the match steward last year.
Awesome. I know that so many of the teams that I've had on the show have specifically mentioned you and how helpful that role was to the season this past year. So talk about like kind of the depth of what your role involved and kind of some of the things that you did during World Championship 7.
Sure. So the appeals is kind of like the big thing on the label. That's what the job is in theory. So do a lot of the appeal stuff, but that's just like the tip of the iceberg as far as my real responsibilities at an event. So I was essentially the person that would go between the builders and the production side and talk to both. And if a team needs more time to repair, they'd be talking to me a lot of the time and saying, hey, we need to be able to do this. Can you shuffle this fight? And we work in production assistants and stuff too, but a lot of the issues that would come up, they'd run through me. Or if there was, say, a fight like Ribot versus Hydra, where both robots tend to like to play configuration games for ever and ever and ever and ever. And I'd usually have to settle what we were finally locking down. It's like, no, you guys have to pick now. You can't just keep changing it on us. We have to get you into the arena. Let's go. But anytime there was an issue, a rules question, even just generally being there as someone that teams could vent to when they were frustrated, I was doing a lot of that. So I think I averaged about 13 hours a day every day for the entirety of filming on set, including the dark days. I think there was one day where Pete, Greg, and I went off and checked out the Pinball Hall of Fame, which was a lot of fun. But even that day, I was on set for like half the day. So a lot of long days, but a lot of really good stuff, and working with the teams and really trying to make it as good an experience for the teams as possible. Because that's really what I viewed the job is. I'm there to make sure the teams are getting what they need and having a good experience.
Right, definitely. Because from what I heard, a big part of it was, the production team, they don't all necessarily understand, the different aspects of the build process. And if somebody has this issue going on, they're not necessarily going to know what that means. But you, as somebody who's built robots, is going to understand specifically what's going on and whether what they're asking for is reasonable.
Oh yeah, so like this is broke, this is how long it'll take to fix. I can usually have a pretty good idea if someone's giving me an accurate timeline or if they're really trying to stretch things out or if they're being way too optimistic and is like, they think it'll take an hour. That's more like a 3 or 4 hour fix. We should try to shove them to the back of the schedule for the day if we can.
Yes. And yeah, it's because it's funny for fans that have never been to BattleBots before, like a live taping, that actually happens quite frequently, where matches have to be shuffled around because of different repair timelines or things like that. So you never know what you're going to see because things can shift at any moment.
Yeah, that was actually a really interesting thing this year is with the fight nights because we told the teams who they were fighting all 4 of their fights right off the bat. It really changed the dynamic of the whole thing. And then every day there'd be a match list sent out with these are today's fights. You already knew you were fighting that day. And then this order gets sent out, and we had to keep reminding people that just because this is the order we send out in the morning does not mean this is the order that's going into the arena. This is robot combat. Things happen. We may need to pull you earlier. And, we had to nudge on some people a few times, but overall it worked really smoothly. I think if I remember correctly, we only went into like overtime hours once or twice the entirety of filming. We never had a day where we didn't get all of the fights in, as far as I can recall. And honestly, that feels kind of amazing given some of the issues that I've heard about in the past with like, oh, we only got in like half the fights we needed that day, and all sorts of things just went off the rails.
Absolutely. Especially because in the couple of cases where robots were stuck together, from my understanding, I wasn't there for any of that, but some of that was fairly lengthy from what I had heard.
Yeah, there were some lengthy separation processes. I think at least one we actually had to pull the bots out of the box and separate them and then put it back in. But yeah, it's always tough when you have this situation where we've got a live show, we need to keep fights moving, and suddenly physics just doesn't want to cooperate.
That darn physics. um so I definitely want to get into a couple of the appeals just because I think those were some of the more significant ones, and one was with Malice. Obviously, I believe the only situation where the appeal was won. Am I correct in that?
As far as fights that have aired, that is the only one that was a successful appeal.
Okay, that's what I
I'm not going to
thought.
talk about anything from side turn.
Right. We're not going to
not on
talk
the show
about
yet.
anything to do with the golden bolt stuff, but yeah, so as far as what we've seen, the only one that was successful, and we know why watching on TV, but obviously like the judges didn't have the best view of what was going on. So kind of take me through that particular appeal.
So that one was kind of a cool one in that it was such a great test of the system for us. And we do the usual routine. Fight ends. I stand up, walk over behind the judges. They do their scorecards, hand to me, walk over to Greg. All it goes to Farouk. Everything happens. And then we get to the interviews at the end of the fight, and Bunny says that Malice's weapon was working at the end. And like, we all kind of just look at each other like, wait, what? Because from where we were sitting on the blue side, the spin up happened while Malice was facing the red square. And when it spun around, to us, it just looked like that was inertia from the robot spinning around that made the weapon move. And there was no awareness that the weapon still had anything powered because it was damaged. It was definitely damaged, and that's why they didn't spin it. And this is some of the conversation we had is like they knew the weapon was partially damaged but still operational, so they spun it down for the rest of the fight to make sure at the end they could blip it and show that it still at least had some function. So once we saw the footage, it was super, super clear that that got scored wrong. Made it really easy to rescore, shift the fight to Malice from Valkyrie, and that was that. And it was an interesting one. We also filmed a couple different ways of how it got announced, so it's been interesting seeing how the presentation of the appeals has changed over the season. Because throughout all of the appeals, we kept experimenting with the flow of the process and exactly how it was handled. So I was like, the earlier appeals, like the Malice one, we actually did the arguments over in the pit with both team captains there in front of one of the team's pits. And as you're getting later and later in the tournament, when you need the results faster, we started actually filming them basically off to the side of the audience. Like at your background, the blue square side down off of the bleachers on the right, that's basically where we did the appeals for the latter bits of the tournament.
Well, that is I mean, that makes sense because you need to get through them faster. And I think it's interesting how you said like experimenting with the way that was done too, because obviously some of the appeals like were mentioned more like in depth in the context of production, and some it was like just, oh, it happened. And it was more of like an afterthought type of situation.
Yeah, I think part of that's down to whether or not the appeal really would make for an interesting thing to explain on the show. Like the Malice one, you have to show that because it was successful. And I think that's a great way to explain the new system. But when you've got an appeal on a fight where it wasn't really as close as the teams thought it was, then you can kind of say, yeah, they appealed, the judges stuck with their decision, we moved on.
Yes, absolutely. Now, one other appeal that I definitely want to talk about because I've seen so much fan commentary about it, and this was one that I was there for, was the Riptide appeal versus Copperhead in the tournament. And obviously that one was a pretty huge deal because of the where everybody was at in the tournament and everything else like that. It was obviously a pretty close fight from like a viewing perspective. So kind of tell me how close it was from like an evaluating perspective and everything, because that appeal when I was there seemed like a much bigger deal than what it was shown on TV. But I think it was probably best that it was shown on TV the way that it was.
Yeah, I think in the edit they wanted to not dwell too much on that and just move into the rest of the tournament because it is the finals. And this fight was actually a great example of something I ran into with a lot of the appeals, where at the end of a fight, if the match is even remotely close, both teams think they won aggression, both teams think they won control. And it comes down to a lot of the nuance in how aggression and how control are judged to really shift that from one side to the other. The other thing is, I think if Copperhead's wheel hadn't fallen off, there would have been no case to appeal that fight. It would have been such a disparity. There's no chance that Riptide would have won that without the wheel falling off. That's what brought it to being a close fight that was a split decision that became unanimous. And I think it came down to, in the middle of the fight, you lose sense of time as a driver. As a competitor, you completely lose sense of time. You're doing what you're doing in that moment and you're reacting, and the clock sort of ceases to exist until you hear a buzzer. And there was a lot of the middle of the fight where Riptide was upside down. Copperhead was pretty well controlling that middle portion of the fight. and they were consistently throughout the entirety of the fight on the attack with their weapon. There were some stretches in the middle where you saw Riptide try to get it some distance, try to get away from Copperhead. And when both robots spend most of the fight going right at each other, but there's a spot where one of the robots is clearly trying to get away, that's an easy one for the judges to lean towards the robot that's always attacking for aggression. And then Riptide was pretty consistently winning the pushing match. So they had control there, but when you spend the middle of the fight getting tossed around and battered while you're upside down, that's going to keep you from getting that full 3-0 on control. So I think you land in a pretty consistent spot where it's Copperhead wins aggression 2-1, Riptide wins control 2-1, and then damage goes to Copperhead because you've got the weapon loss on Riptide, the drive loss on Copperhead essentially equal out, but then there's a lot of defensive damage to Riptide from all the stuff getting chewed on and little wedgelets getting ripped off and things like that. So that shifts it 3-2 for Copperhead on damage, and I think that's where all the judges ended up landing.
I think so. And that explanation makes a lot of sense. That's what I saw, and hopefully that may help clear things up for anyone who was confused as to how the scoring ended up breaking down.
I will say this: the dude that drove Riptide did a fantastic job hopping in on a bot that he'd essentially never driven before, and when the weapon breaks that early, you're in a really tough spot. To keep his composure and keep in the fight as well as he did is impressive.
Yes, 100%. Felix deserves a lot of kudos. So yeah. So I mean, overall, like then that I was gonna say the other thing that I was curious about too. I mean, I obviously Jonathan didn't appeal the finals match. I don't foresee any situation where he would have appealed it, but I mean, I'm just curious from a perspective of you seeing the fight. How close was that fight? And had he appealed it, do you think that still holds up?
That one, that's a great question. First thing I want to say, out of all of the World Championship finals, so since the reboot on ABC, I think this is probably my favorite finals. Like, this was a way better fight than the one I was in. This is a better fight than any of the other finals in my book of the reboot, possibly in the entirety of the sport, because I can't think of any of the Comedy Central era finals that were as exciting to watch as this one. And I'm really, really glad they didn't appeal. So I think they wouldn't have been out of line to appeal in my book. Like, it was a close enough fight. I would not have held anything against them for appealing, but I think the judges got it right. I think they recognized that the strategy Sawblaze went for worked and worked well enough to give them the win.
Yes.
But the way the whole process works is, I get the cards from each judge individually. The judges don't compare their scores. So I'm the first one that finds out who won the tournament. I let Greg know, and then it processes through. So I'm stone facing the whole thing and just looking at these cards going, I really hope there's no appeal here. Because the last thing I want to do is, this is the main event of the whole tournament, and then we have a delay because there's an appeal. And, the appeals process, I think by this point we had working really well, but everyone is going to be so much more ramped up because it's the finals. And that's just going to make it even more weird than it is. So I was really glad when you said he wasn't going to appeal that one.
Well, knowing Jonathan, I would have been absolutely shocked if he had. But I was there. I watched it live in the arena, and I truly did not know which way it was going to go. And honestly, I would have been happy either way. Like, I wouldn't have been upset no matter what happened.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's one thing I told the whole huge team this year is, they really have that bot dialed in this season. I was so impressed with how much more of a presence it had in the arena this season. Like, huge in the past has been scary, but it hasn't really been able to dominate fights the way it did this year. This year, they were the dominant bot in a lot of fights, and it was genuinely impressive with how well it was working. Like, any other opponent, and like there's not many bots outside of Sawblaze I think Huge wouldn't have beaten this year with how well they were running. Like I'm not going to name names because it's a long list to go through, but like Huge, I think almost any other opponent in the top 32 they'd have had a really good shot against too. Like they made the finals for a reason. That bot was phenomenal this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they bring next year.
Yes, 100%. Which speaking of, I did want to kind of get your thoughts too, as somebody who's competed and everything else like that. And this season was certainly like the true meta breaking season, not just with bots who, went deep in the tournament, but just in general, seeing a robot like Claw Viper do so well, seeing Fusion take it to Witch Doctor, like all of these things that were really unexpected. And I think that that's what made this season so great. What's your thought on all of that?
Absolutely. So my personal favorite style of bot is aggressive control bots. So I was just so happy to see Claw Viper just dominating fights this year and really bringing it to top tier robots. Like Kevin did an amazing job driving. The bot looked amazing. It was such a fun fight to watch. I'm also going to give a quick shout out to some of the wilder designs that showed up that were really like unexpected things that did work well. Horizon, like that's a bot where they brought in such a weird weapon type that I don't think anyone was really ready for. And yeah, it had some new bot teething issues. Every new bot's going to have teething issues, but they delivered on the promise of how the bot works. And that's what I wanted to see from them this year. Triton, like that thing looked really good for a bot that was finished in the pits before the event started. And I think with a season under their belt and some time to refine things, it's going to be pretty devastating competitor. Like watching it drive around the box, it was fast. It was scary. I just wish they could figure out how to make the gearbox a little quieter. It doesn't come across on the show, but that thing was loud.
Yeah. I mean, so many of the new bots, the new designs were incredible. I mean, obviously, like I'm a huge, massive Ripperoni fan. I just think that like the whole thing is great. The theme, the people, the bot, like everything is awesome with that. Yeah. I mean, I again like the future of BattleBots, I think, looks so bright when you see a lot of these interesting robots that could have really strong futures in the sport.
Exactly. I love when a team comes in with a bit of a wild idea and really puts in the effort and makes it work. And yeah, Ripperoni is a great example. Horizon's a great example. Fusion really is another great example of something that probably shouldn't work, that they've really gotten to the point where it is a legitimately scary robot. It's just a little too on fire a lot of the time. I mean, maybe the key is
Little
they've
less
got to get the
fire.
right amount of fire, because I think one of their fights they won while on fire. So it's just figuring out the right amount of fire per minute.
Exactly.
Maybe
Black
there's a
Dragon.
BTU per hour rating for Fusion that they need to find out.
Black Dragon has proven that it is possible to win while on fire.
Exactly. Maybe we need like a Reese Brazilian hybrid team.
Hey, I guess anything is possible. Now I'm curious, now that the season's wrapped up, what do you have going on in the off season and everything else while we're kind of waiting for the next filming to happen?
It's been a busy off season. So I just finished up my master's degree in systems engineering. I was actually taking a course during BattleBots filming. So there was a couple of days where I do 14 hours on set, go to the hotel room, do some homework, and then go to bed. And think that night I might have been chatting configurations with Ricky Willems for Mammoth stuff, like rules questions in bed, texting with Ricky at like 1 a.m. The job didn't really ever end. On top of that, I've also been getting pretty heavily involved in the National Havoc Robotics League, the NHRL, working with them on a lot of stuff behind the scenes. So that's been ramping up pretty steadily since the beginning of the year. And that is looking like it's going to continue. So a lot of fun things on the horizon there.
Absolutely. And for anybody that didn't hear that or wasn't aware of the change, National Havoc Robotics League. So it's big stuff coming on that end. I have no doubt.
Yeah, I really look forward to seeing what happens with the NHRL. It's I can't say anything obviously, but a lot of what I've heard is stuff that's been things I've really liked hearing, and I'm excited for where things can go.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So very bright future for those involved in combat robotics, for fans of combat robotics. So I'm very excited, but awesome. Well, for anybody that is watching, obviously, please make sure that you continue to support the show, like, subscribe, comment, share, all of that good stuff. And we have lots of NHRL content coming your way very soon, as the BattleBots is taking a break until the Golden Bolt stuff. So a lot to look forward to, but just keep watching, and we'll see everybody next time on the show.
Thanks for having me.